Lavengro by George Borrow. Chapter 6. Years passed on, even 3 years. During this period I had increased considerably in stature and in strength, and let us hope improved in mind, for I had entered on the study of the Latin language. The very first person to whose care I was entrusted for the acquisition of Latin was an old friend of my father's, a clergyman, who kept a seminary at a town the very next to be visited after our departure from the Cross. Under his instruction, however, I continued only a few weeks, as we speedily left the place. "Captain," said this divine, when my father came to take leave of him on the eve of our departure, "I have a friendship for you, and therefore wish to give you a piece of advice concerning this son of yours. You are now removing him from my care. You do wrong, but we will let that pass. Listen to me. There is but one good school book in the world, the one I use in my seminary, Lilly's Latin Grammar, in which your son has already made some progress. If you are anxious for the success of your son in life, for the correctness of his conduct and the soundness of his principles, keep him to Lilly's Latin Grammar. If you can by any means, either fair or foul, induce him to get by heart Lilly's Grammar, you may set your heart at rest with respect to him. I myself will be his warrant. I never yet knew a boy that was induced either by fair means or foul to learn Lilly's Latin Grammar by heart, who did not turn out a man, provided he lived long enough." My father, who did not understand the classical languages, received with respect the advice of his old friend, and from that moment conceived the highest opinion of Lilly's Latin Grammar. During 3 years I studied Lilly's Latin Grammar under the tuition of various schoolmasters, for I travelled with the regiment, and in every town in which we were stationary I was invariably, God bless my father, sent to the classical academy of the place. It chanced by good fortune that in the generality of these schools the grammar of Lilly was in use. When, however, that was not the case, it made no difference in my educational course, my father always stipulating with the masters that I should be daily examined in Lilly. At the end of the 3 years I had the whole by heart. You had only to repeat the first 2 or 3 words of any sentence in any part of the book, and forthwith I would open cry, commencing without blundering and hesitation, and continue till you were glad to beg me to leave off, with many expressions of admiration at my proficiency in the Latin language. Sometimes, however, to convince you how well I merited these encomiums, I would follow you to the bottom of the stair, and even into the street, repeating in a kind of sing-song measure the sonorous lines of the Golden Schoolmaster. If I am here asked whether I understood anything of what I had got by heart, I reply, never mind, I understand it all now, and believe that no one ever yet got Lilly's Latin Grammar by heart when young, who repented of the feat at a mature age. And when my father saw that I had accomplished my task, he opened his mouth and said, "Truly, this is more than I expected. I did not think that there had been so much in you, either of application or capacity. You have now learnt all that is necessary. If my friend Dr. B.'s opinion was sterling, as I have no doubt it was, you are still a child, however, and must yet go to school, in order that you may be kept out of evil company. Perhaps you may still contrive, now you have exhausted the barn, to pick up a grain or 2 in the barnyard. You are still ignorant of figures, I believe. Not that I would mention figures in the same day with Lilly's Grammar." These words were uttered in a place called fill in the blank, in the north, or in the road to the north, to which, for some time past, our corps had been slowly advancing. I was sent to the school of the place, which chanced to be a day school. It was a somewhat extraordinary one, and a somewhat extraordinary event occurred to me within its walls. It occupied part of the farther end of a small plain or square at the outskirts of the town, close to some extensive bleaching fields. It was a long low building of one room, with no upper story. On the top was a kind of wooden box or sconce, which I at first mistook for a pigeon house, but which in reality contained a bell, to which was attached a rope, which, passing through the ceiling, hung dangling in the middle of the schoolroom. I am the more particular in mentioning this appurtenance, as I had soon occasion to scrape acquaintance with it in a manner not very agreeable to my feelings. The master was very proud of his bell, if I might judge from the fact of his eyes being frequently turned to that part of the ceiling from which the rope depended. Twice a day, namely, after the morning and evening tasks had been gone through, were the boys rung out of school by the monotonous jingle of this bell. This ringing out was rather a lengthy affair, for, as the master was a man of order and method, the boys were only permitted to go out of the room one by one, and as they were rather numerous, amounting at least to 100, and were taught to move at a pace of suitable decorum, at least a quarter of an hour elapsed from the commencement of the march before the last boy could make his exit. The office of bell ringer was performed by every boy successively, and it so happened that the very first day of my attendance at the school, the turn to ring the bell had, by order of succession, arrived at the place which I had been allotted to me, for the master, as I have already observed, was a man of method and order, and every boy had a particular seat, to which he became a fixture as long as he continued at the school. So upon this day, when the tasks were done and completed, and the boys sat with their hats and caps in their hands, anxiously expecting the moment of dismissal, it was suddenly notified to me by the urchins who sat nearest to me that I must get up and ring the bell. Now, as this was the first time that I had been at the school, I was totally unacquainted with the process, which I had never seen, and indeed had never heard of, till that moment. I therefore sat still, not imagining it possible that any such duty could be required of me. But now, with not a little confusion, I perceived that the eyes of all the boys in the school were fixed upon me. Presently there were nods and winks in the direction of the bell rope, and as these produced no effect, uncouth visages were made, like those of monkeys when enraged. Teeth were gnashed, tongues thrust out, and even fists were bent at me. The master, who stood at the end of the room, with a huge ferule under his arm, bent full upon me a look of stern appeal, and the ushers, of whom there were 4, glared upon me, each from his own particular corner, as I vainly turned in one direction and another in search of one reassuring look. But now, probably in obedience to a sign from the master, the boys in my immediate neighbourhood began to maltreat me. Some pinched me with their fingers, some buffeted me, whilst others pricked me with pins or the points of compasses. These arguments were not without effect. I sprang from my seat and endeavoured to escape along a double line of benches thronged with boys of all ages, from the urchin of 6 or 7 to the nondescript of 16 or 17. It was like running the gauntlet, every one, great or small, pinching, kicking, or otherwise maltreating me as I passed by. Goaded on in this manner, I at length reached the middle of the room, where dangled the bell rope, the cause of all my sufferings. I should have passed it, for my confusion was so great that I was quite at a loss to comprehend what all this could mean, and almost believed myself under the influence of an ugly dream. But now the boys, who were seated in advance in the row, arose with one accord and barred my further progress, and one, doubtless more sensible than the rest, seizing the rope, thrust it into my hand. I now began to perceive that the dismissal of the school and my own release from torment depended upon this self-same rope. I therefore, in a fit of desperation, pulled it once or twice, and then left off, naturally supposing that I had done quite enough. The boys who sat next the door no sooner heard the bell than, rising from their seats, they moved out at the door. The bell, however, had no sooner ceased to jingle than they stopped short and, turning round, stared at the master, as much to say, "What are we to do now?" This was too much for the patience of the man of method, which my previous stupidity had already nearly exhausted. Dashing forward into the middle of the room, he struck me violently on the shoulders with his ferule, and, snatching the rope out of my hand, exclaimed with a stentorian voice and genuine Yorkshire accent, "Prodigy of ignorance, dost not even know how to ring a bell?" I can't do it all of accent. "Must I myself instruct thee?" He then commenced pulling at the bell with such violence that long before half the school was dismissed the rope broke, and the rest of the boys had to depart without their accustomed music. But I must not linger here, though I could say much about the school and the pedagogue, highly amusing and diverting, which, however, I suppress in order to make way for matters of yet greater interest. On we went, northward, and as we advanced, I saw that the country was becoming widely different from those parts of merry England in which we had previously travelled. It was wilder and less cultivated, and more broken with hills and hillocks. The people, too, of these regions appeared to partake of something of the character of their country. They were coarsely dressed, tall and sturdy of frame. Their voices were deep and guttural, and the half of the dialect which they spoke was unintelligible to my ears. I often wondered where we could be going, for I was at this time about as ignorant of geography as I was of most other things. However, I held my peace, asked no questions, and patiently awaited the issue. Northward still, and it came to pass that one morning I found myself extended on the bank of a river. It was a beautiful morning of early spring. Small white clouds were floating in the heaven, occasionally veiling the countenance of the sun, whose light, as they retired, would again burst forth, coursing like a racehorse over the scene, and a goodly scene it was. Before me, across the water, on an eminence, stood a white old city surrounded with lofty walls, above which rose the tops of tall houses, with here and there a church or steeple. To my right hand was a long and massive bridge, with many arches, and of antique architecture, which traversed the river. The river was a noble one, the broadest that I had hitherto seen, its waters of a greenish tinge, poured with impetuosity beneath the narrow arches to meet the sea close at hand, as the boom of the billows breaking distinctly upon a beach declared. There were songs upon the river from the fisher barks, and occasionally a chorus, plaintive and wild, such as I had never heard before, the words of which I did not understand, but which at the present time, down the long avenue of years, seem in memory's ear to sound like Horum coram Dego. Several robust fellows were near me, some knee-deep in water, employed in hauling the seine upon the strand. Huge fish were struggling amidst the meshes, princely salmon, their brilliant mail of blue and silver flashing in the morning beam, so goodly and gay a scene, in truth, and had never greeted my boyish eye. And as I gazed upon the prospect, my bosom began to heave and my tears to trickle. Was it the beauty of the scene which gave rise to these emotions? Possibly, for though a poor ignorant child, a half-wild creature, I was not insensible to the loveliness of nature, and took pleasure in the happiness and handiworks of my fellow creatures. Yet perhaps in something more deep and mysterious the feelings which then pervaded me might originate. Who can lie down on Elvere Hill, without experiencing something of the sorcery of the place. Flee from Elvere Hill, young swain, or the maids of El will have power over you, and you will go elf wild. So say the Danes. I had unconsciously laid myself down upon haunted ground, and I am willing to imagine that what I then experienced was rather connected with the world of spirits and dreams than with what I actually saw and heard around me. Surely the elves and genii of the place were conversing by some inscrutable means with the principle of intelligence lurking within the poor uncultivated clod. Perhaps to that ethereal principle the wonders of the past as connected with the stream, the glories of the present, and even the history of the future were at that moment being revealed. Of how many feats of chivalry had these old walls been witness when hostile kings contended for their possession? How many an army from the south and from the north had trod that old bridge? What red and noble blood had crimsoned those rushing waters? What strains had been sung, aye, were yet being sung on its banks, some soft as Doric reed, some fierce and sharp as those of Norwegian Skaldaglum, some as replete with wild and wizard force as Finland's runes, singing of Kalevala's moors, and the deeds of Wionomionen, Woinum Oinen, Woin Omoinen. That's a tricky word to say. Honour to thee, thou island stream. Onward may thou ever roll, fresh and green, rejoicing in thy bright past, thy glorious present, and in vivid hope of a triumphant future. Flow on, beautiful one. Which of the world's streams canst thou envy with thy beauty and renown? Stately as the Danube, rolling in its might through the lands romantic with the wild exploits of Turk, Polak and Magyar. Lovely as the Rhine, on its shelvy banks grows the racy grape, and strange old keeps of robber knights of yore are reflected in its waters from picturesque crags and airy headlands. Yet neither the stately Danube nor the beauteous Rhine with all their fame, though abundant, needst thou envy, thou pure island stream, and far less yon turbid river of old, not modern renown, gurgling beneath the walls of what was once proud Rome, towering Rome, Jupiter's town, but now vile Rome, crumbling Rome, Batusha's town. Far less needst thou envy the turbid Tiber of bygone fame, creeping sadly to the sea, surcharged with the abominations of modern Rome. How unlike to thee, thou pure island stream! And as I lay on the bank and wept, there drew nigh to me a man in the habiliments of a fisher. He was bare-legged, of a weather-beaten countenance, and of stature approaching to the gigantic. "What is the gallant greeting for?" said he, as he stopped and surveyed me. "Has anybody wrought ye ony harm?" "Not that I know of," I replied, rather guessing that at than understanding his question. "I was crying because I could not help it. I say, old one, what is the name of this river?" "Hoot! I now see what you was greeting at your ain ignorance, nae doot. 'Tis very great. Weel, I will na fash ye with reproaches, but even enlighten ye, since you seem a decent man's bairn, and ye speir a civil question. Yon river is called the Tweed, and yonder, over the brig, is Scotland. Did ye never hear of the Tweed, my bonny man?" "No," said I, as I rose from the grass, and proceeded to cross the bridge to the town at which we had arrived the preceding night. "I never heard of it. But now I have seen it, I shall not soon forget it. End of chapter 6. Like and subscribe for the next chapter.